Hey, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to answer some of your most frequently asked questions about using fresh milled flour. These are questions that you have asked me in the comments, my DMs, and even in email, and I picked the ones that I have received the most to help you feel more confident with milling your own flour at home. Now, the one question that I get all the time and I see all over the internet right now is, why is it so hard to get a grain mill? If you have been looking to purchase a grain mill, you've probably found that you cannot get one right away, at least not all the time. Sometimes there are releases and you can grab one, but they're going really fast and the wait can be really long. In fact, I had to wait months to get my mock mill. There are a number of reasons for this, and one, milling your own flour at home has recently surged in popularity. So there's just a supply versus demand issue. But when I was purchasing my mock mill, there was a really long wait, and I asked the folks over at Breadtopia why there was such a long wait. At the time, and this was in mid-2024, they said that yes, it is partially supply and demand, but on top of that, there's a part in grain mills that is hard to get right now. So they're also waiting on parts sometimes. Now, I don't know if that is still true in 2025, but that was the case at the time. And for sure, it is still a little hard to get grain mills. But the good news is, if you get one and just wait for it, you will not regret that decision. It is worth the wait. Now, if you have spent any time around my YouTube channel or my blog, moonandmagnolia.com, you probably know that I love all things sourdough. So I get a lot of sourdough, and right now I've been getting a lot of fresh milled flour sourdough questions. So I want to answer a few of your questions about using fresh milled flour for sourdough. And the one that I get the most is, can I use fresh milled flour for my starter? Absolutely you can. And in fact, fresh milled flour is really great for your starter because it contains a ton of micronutrients that yeast and bacteria can feed off of and give you a really healthy starter. I have a full tutorial on YouTube and over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com about what types of flour you can feed your starter and how to transition your starter into a new type of flour. I will leave links for those in the description box below. But what makes this really easy is that your sourdough starter can be fed any type of wheat flour. So as long as you're feeding it some sort of wheat, whether that is hard red wheat or hard white wheat, rye, it will do just fine. But there are a couple of things to keep in mind when it comes to feeding your starter fresh milled flour. One, because fresh milled flour has so many micronutrients for all of that wild yeast and bacteria in your starter, it metabolizes it really quickly. So if you are used to feeding your starter, say all-purpose flour or bread flour, and it takes, say, 12 hours for it to double and get bubbly, you might find that when you feed your starter fresh milled flour, it only takes maybe 4 hours or 6 hours because it metabolizes all those nutrients really quickly. The other thing that you might notice when you feed your sourdough starter fresh milled flour, and this has been true just in my experience, is that it isn't quite as dramatic as feeding your starter with, say, all-purpose or bread flour. When you feed your sourdough starter all-purpose or bread flour from the store, for example, it gets really big. Sometimes it doubles or triples in size and there's really big holes, which is kind of fun, I know. But when you feed it fresh milled flour, you may notice that it isn't quite as dramatic and that the rise is a little more subtle. And there are a few reasons for this. One, fresh milled flour contains all three parts of the wheat berry, the endosperm, bran, and germ. That bran and germ are heavy. Store-bought flour doesn't have the bran and germ in it, at least not in large quantities. So it is a lighter flour. But fresh milled flour, because it has that bran and germ in it, it's heavy, so it just can't rise quite as much. The other thing is fresh milled flour has a different and more complex gluten network than store-bought flours. So it just rises differently. I've noticed sometimes that when I'm bulk fermenting my dough, for example, that it rises a little more outward than up, but it's still fermenting. And the same thing is true with your sourdough starter. That different gluten network is just going to have a different outcome as your starter metabolizes all of those nutrients. So even though it doesn't look the same, it still has all that active yeast and bacteria in it. So what we're looking for with a fresh milled flour sourdough starter is for it to rise a little bit and to make sure it still has bubbles throughout. But just because the bubbles aren't as huge and the rise isn't as dramatic doesn't mean that it's not working. One thing I want to mention about this too is that you don't really have to feed your sourdough starter fresh milled flour unless you want to. These are all things that you get to choose to do, and often when we're talking about sourdough and fresh milled flour, we can create combinations that work for our health needs, our lifestyle, and just the things that we want to do. So often when I feed my starter, it's usually late at night. feeling pretty lazy and I don't always feel like milling flour. So I regularly feed my starter with all-purpose flour, but I make my bread with fresh milled flour. That is totally fine. You can even do a combination of all-purpose flour and fresh milled flour to feed your starter. You can do 100% fresh milled flour. Really, the choice is yours. Okay, next up, when making sourdough with fresh milled flour, how do I adjust the bulk fermentation time? What I really want to emphasize here is that no matter what type of sourdough you're making, whether it's with fresh milled flour or store-bought all-purpose flour, don't look at the time, look at the dough. Pay attention to the qualities of the dough, not how long it has been fermenting, because time really isn't an indicator if your dough has fermented enough. Bulk fermenting sourdough is a combination of many factors, including the strength of your starter, the temperature of the room, and time. So you can't just look at time because there are other factors that come into play. So say, for example, you fed your sourdough starter, use it at its peak, your house is 77 degrees, that is going to bulk ferment a lot faster than, say, an unfed sourdough starter that's in a 70-degree room. So the stronger your starter, the warmer the space, the faster it will bulk ferment. The weaker your starter, the cooler the space, the slower it will bulk ferment. And these are factors that we can't always control. So what I always recommend is to look at your dough. When making fresh milled flour sourdough, I have found that it doesn't really double. Just like I mentioned talking about the sourdough starter and how it isn't as dramatic, I found the same thing to be true with fresh milled flour. So what I recommend then for bulk fermenting your fresh milled flour sourdough is, one, use a container with tall sides so it can actually hold the shape of the dough. That can give you a better indication of how much it has increased in size. And what we're looking for here is somewhere between 20 and 30% increase in size. You can give or take a little bit with that. It's not quite so simple as just a number like that, but we are looking for somewhere in that like 30% range. But most importantly, the visual indicator that I look for is to see if the dough is domed on top. When it is domed on top, that usually means that your bread is ready for proofing or whatever the next step of your recipe is. So don't get hung up on time and metrics that you can't really control. Look for things that you can actually identify, like a 20 to 30% increase in size, and most importantly, a domed top on your dough. Okay, next up, why is my fresh milled sourdough turning out gummy or dense? The first thing I think we need to do here is really define gummy and dense, because in my mind, they are not actually the same things. When we are talking about gummy bread, we're talking about a really heavy, wet, gummy texture in the bread. So gummy bread, when you cut into it, it is heavy and thick and wet, and it looks like bread that hasn't baked long enough. I define dense bread as something a little bit different. For me, dense bread is bread that just isn't quite as light and fluffy. It's cooked all the way through, it's not wet, it just doesn't have big air pockets or holes in it like we'd often want in our sourdough bread. So first, let's talk about gummy bread. Gummy bread is almost always the result of underproofing your dough. So if you are letting your dough bulk ferment, it is not getting, say, 20 to 30% in size, and it is not doming on top, but you move through the process anyway, you might find that it is gummy on the inside. So if you keep finding that your dough is gummy, I really encourage you to let it bulk ferment a little bit longer. There could be a few other reasons for gummy bread, like maybe too much hydration, for example, but almost always when I see pictures of people's bread and it's gummy and then I look at their process, it just didn't bulk ferment long enough. So I really encourage you to try to bulk ferment your bread a little bit longer if you find that it is gummy when you cut into it. Dense bread is something different. When you cut into dense bread, it is not wet or sticky inside. It just doesn't have big air pockets. There's a couple reasons this happens with fresh milled flour bread. One, it's just the way it is. I think as bakers, we do have to adjust our expectations a little bit with fresh milled flour because it does have the bran and the germ in it. So that dough is just a little bit heavier. So you don't always get those giant air pockets like you would, say, with all-purpose flour. You can get your fresh milled flour sourdough to be pretty close to bread made with all-purpose flour, but in my experience, it's just a little more dense because it is 100% whole grain flour. So that's just the nature of it. Now, another thing though that can lead to dense bread is not developing the gluten enough. So if you're making a rustic no-knead sourdough, for example, make sure you're doing all of your stretch and folds. If you're making bread in a stand mixer, say you're making a sandwich bread or something like that, make sure that dough achieves the window pane test. And I hear a lot of questions about fresh milled flour and the window pane test. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But fully developing the gluten makes a stronger dough, which seems a little counterintuitive because when you think strong dough, you think tough bread. But what we want is a strong dough to hold those air pockets. If the dough is not strong enough to hold the air pockets, it will be more dense. So we want to fully develop that gluten to hold air. Before we get to the next question, I just want to give you a quick reminder that I do have a full video about making sourdough with fresh milled flour that has some tips and tricks that are really unique to making sourdough with fresh milled flour. So I will leave a link for that in the description box below. But since I just mentioned the window pane test, let's talk about the window pane test. I see people all over the internet mention that they cannot get their fresh milled flour dough to achieve the window pane test. And I want to reassure you that you definitely can achieve the window pane test with fresh milled flour, but you just have to get the ingredients and the kneading right. The window pane test is just a really simple way of looking at your dough to see if the gluten has developed enough. In short, you just stretch a small piece of dough, and if you can see light through it, that means it has developed enough gluten. And now the window pane test is a little tricky with fresh milled flour because the gluten network is different and it has that bran and germ. Achieving the window pane test with fresh milled flour does take a little bit more attention. And I should note too that if you're kneading by hand, it's going to take a lot more time, and it probably depends on the type of mixer that you use. I use a KitchenAid stand mixer. You can probably see it back here. I have not made bread with any type of mixer, so I can't speak to other types of mixers. But one thing that's really important to note when it comes to preparing your dough to achieve the window pane test is first, you have to let it autolyze. Autolyzing is the process of letting that fresh milled flour absorb the liquid. If that flour has not absorbed the liquid, it's going to be really hard to get a glutinous, stretchy dough. So what I usually do is I mix together all of my ingredients until they are combined, and then I let the dough sit for about 30 minutes to an hour. And at that point, it is a much more workable dough. Then I start to knead my bread. So only after the autolyzing do I knead the bread. As you're kneading the bread, you can assess if you need to make any changes. If it is way too sticky, you can throw a little more flour in there. If it is way too dry, put a little water in there. If I have to make those adjustments, I usually just put them in 1 tablespoon at a time until it achieves the right consistency. So at this point, while you are kneading the dough, what you're looking for in the quality and the texture of the dough is for it to feel like any other dough. If you are used to making bread with all-purpose flour or bread flour, you're looking for the same qualities in this dough. Now it's going to feel a little different because it has the bran and the germ in it. It's not the exact same type of flour, but it shouldn't make a mess of your hands. It shouldn't be sticking all over the bowl. It should feel like good dough. Once I get the quality of the dough right, I just keep kneading it in my stand mixer. And usually it takes me anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes. I think it takes a little bit longer with fresh milled flour than it does with all-purpose flour, but not by much. Now, when it comes time to actually try the window pane test, I do recommend tearing off a piece of dough and then stretching it gently to see if light passes through it. One thing to keep in mind though is because fresh milled flour has a different gluten network and because it has the bran and germ in it, it is not going to stretch in the same way that all-purpose flour will. It will be a much less dramatic window pane test, but you will still be able to see light pass through it. If you pull it too hard, it will break because that's just what happens. And you also can't pull it quite as hard as you can with all-purpose flour because that bran is a little bit sharp and it can actually cut your window pane test open. So just gently pull it. If you can see light pass through your dough before it breaks, you have achieved the window pane test. It is totally possible if you let the dough autolyze, if you adjust the dough so it feels like good dough and you knead it long enough. And now the last thing I do want to mention about the window pane test is make sure you are using hard wheat for your bread because soft wheat does not have the gluten needed for bread. So you'll never get the window pane test to work properly if you're using soft wheat. So make sure you're always using hard wheat. Let's talk about some practical tips for home millers. So a question I see a lot is, can I substitute fresh milled flour for all-purpose at a 1-to-1 ratio? Yes and no. It depends on if you're using soft wheat or hard wheat. And to make this really easy for you, I actually have a conversion chart over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com that you can download and print and just stick in your pantry. And it has all the conversions you need for soft wheat and hard wheat. So I'll leave a link for that in the description box. But to answer your question, yes, you can substitute hard wheat 1-to-1 for all purpose. And it works if you're measuring in cups pretty well, but if you're measuring in grams, it's pretty darn precise. Cups is a little bit tricky because how flour is milled and how it compacts into the actual measuring cup itself is different. So 1-to-1 ratio isn't really a 1-to-1 ratio, but if you're weighing in grams, the 1-to-1 ratio is always precise because whether it's all-purpose flour or fresh milled flour, 500 grams is 500 grams. Now keep in mind though that fresh milled hard wheat does require a little bit more water, so you might find that you need to add a little bit extra hydration to your recipes, but I usually just eyeball that. I just work my recipe as usual, and if I need to add, say, an egg or, I don't know, a few more grams of water, I just do that as needed. Soft wheat, though, isn't quite as precise because it actually has more moisture in it. That's what makes it a soft wheat. So in comparison to store-bought flour, you will need to increase the amount of home milled soft wheat that you're using. So generally you will need a 1/4 cup, or that is equivalent to 30 grams more soft white wheat per cup called for in the recipe. But I have all these conversions laid out for you on that free conversion chart, so don't forget to get that. I have a small pantry. I don't have a lot of room for grains. Which one should I keep? So if you can only fit one type of grain in your pantry, I strongly recommend a hard white wheat. A hard white wheat can be used across the board in anything from bread to pastries, and it has a mild flavor. So if you really can only fit one grain, that's definitely the one I would go with. But of course, if you prefer hard red wheat, you can use that too. But I do think a hard white wheat is more versatile. If you have room for a little bit more, I recommend a hard wheat and a soft wheat. Hard wheats are for things like bread or that need gluten development. Soft wheat is for things like pastries, cookies, muffins, those sorts of things. So it is nice to have a little bit of both if possible. But again, if you really only have room for one, choose a hard white wheat. And if you have room for two, get a hard wheat and a soft wheat. How long does fresh milled flour last? There's a lot of chatter about this, and I don't necessarily have the exact answer for you, but this is what I do know. As soon as you mill your wheat berries, they do start to oxidize. And as it oxidizes, it loses its nutritional value. And on top of that, because it is 100% whole grain, it has oils in it, and those oils also start to oxidize. And it can go bad eventually in ways that store-bought flour doesn't go bad because it doesn't have the bran and the germ in it, and those oils are removed. So it doesn't last as long as something from the store, but it doesn't go bad within minutes. To get the most nutritional bang for your buck, mill your grains right before you use them. And if I have extra, I just put them in little sandwich baggies. I label it with what it is, and then I put all those little sandwich baggies into one Ziploc bag and just stick it right in the freezer. I'm not a food scientist. I'm not a nutritionist. I don't have the exact answer for how long it will last. But in general, what I hear most experts say is that your fresh milled flour can last for a few days at room temperature and for about 3 to 6 months in the freezer. But the cool thing is though, if your whole grains are stored properly, they can last for many years. So if you're worried about things going bad, just mill your grains as you need them because those wheat berries, they will last you a really long time. A lot of you have also asked, where is a good place to get wheat berries? There are a lot of places you can get them. I see folks on Facebook all the time mentioning farms that they get theirs from, but I usually get mine from Azure Standard, and I also really like a small farm out west called Grains in the Plains. I've had good experiences with both of them, and they are really great if you want to get big bags of grains. I usually get mine in 25-pound bags. But one thing that I like to do if I'm testing a grain, just to see if I like the way it tastes, is I'll get a small bag from Amazon. It's not the most cost efficient or cost effective way to get grains, but what I don't want is 25 pounds of grains that we're not going to use and that we don't like. So that's a really great way just to sort of dip your toe in different types of grains to see if you like them before you invest in 25 pounds or more from somewhere else. I wouldn't recommend getting big batches of grains on Amazon because they're really expensive that way. Local co-ops often have grains, and I also see a lot of people mention that they get really nice grains from Amish communities nearby, so that is something to check into also. Now, of course, this doesn't cover everything you need to know about using fresh milled flour. I will leave links for all of my resources for fresh milled flour and my fresh milled flour recipes in the description box. But if you have more questions about using fresh milled flour, whether it's for baking desserts or even sourdough, drop them in the comments and I will will answer your questions for you. And also, to stay in the know and to get all of my fresh mo flour recipes, resources, and tutorials, be sure to sign up for the email list. When you do, I will send you links to all of my recipes, tutorials, videos, and more directly to your inbox. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I'll see you again next time.